Okay. So this is actually a question. So I really appreciated so much of the discussion.
Why don't you identify yourself?
Leslie Turner, University of Maryland. So much of the discussion from the international panel framing income-based repayment or ICL, whatever you want to call it, in terms of insurance or social insurance. I think that's really appropriate. One question I had for the experts here is, when we think of other social insurance programs, oftentimes we worry about moral hazard, or that the existence of this program will cause people to change their behavior, whether it be they take an easier major in school, or they take a lower paying job after college. And I just was wondering if there is any evidence on how large is moral hazard. Is there any evidence that these programs do distort people's behavior? And if so, to what extent? Thank you.
So, Elaine, are you willing?
No, I think
Lorraine? Okay. But I also wanted you to say something about the incentives created when you've got the mortgage, because you made this point about the mortgage, when you've got a 47% tax rate.
So I didn't show my picture, but basically, you had a 49% ranging down to about 12% over the 10 years for these low-paid women, whereas over 25 years, it maxed at just under 5%, right at the end, but basically it was very small incentives. I mean, surely, what is that going to do to somebody when they're choosing a job? What is it going to do to decisions over when you have children and stuff? It's going to be influenced by, the design of the tax system, whereas under the other system, there's very little incentive effects.
So I guess the point being that there's also incentives within the mortgage-based program.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd say they're larger. Yeah.
Okay.
Nick? You cannot, what economists call second-best economics says there is no single perfect solution. If you have a pension system that's got a poverty relief element, it will cause labour supply disincentives. The cure is to have a pension system with no poverty relief. The cure is worse than the disease. The way to have student loans with no incentives is to have no student loans. The purpose of student loans is to encourage the efficient volume of investment in skills. Any loan system will create some adverse incentives. The trick is to choose a loan design that has as few adverse incentives as possible and as many good incentives as possible. We've heard from Lorraine, if you have a dumb mortgage type system, it will create dumb effects. If you have a badly designed dumb income contingent system with an interest subsidy where everybody borrows as much as possible even when they don't notice, that will cause adverse incentives. So the answer is any system will cause some adverse incentives. You design a system to have as few bad ones as possible and as many good ones as possible.
So I think my question was sort of taken differently than I intended. So, a critic of income-based repayment could argue it will cause moral hazard. And I just was wondering, but, from an empirical perspective, it could have very, very, very small effects, right? And so I was wondering, given that you all are experts, is there any evidence from research? Have you looked at, does people's effort in school...
So Bruce looks like he has an answer.
I'm not saying this is...
Okay, let's let him answer. And one point, somebody might have their cell phone on because we're getting a buzzing. So if any of you turned your cell phone on during the break, turn it off.
So the first point is that the Australian system, which has been around for 27 years now, has been subject to a lot of study about whether or not changes in the system change behaviour. And the overall bottom line is nothing can be found. And it was radical to go from zero tuition to about a quarter of recurrent costs, like overnight. There didn't seem to be any effects on demand. In fact, enrolments went up. But one of the critical things to note here is while there might be in theory adverse consequences or any consequences, the important question is how big are they likely to be? So ask yourself this question: would you change your occupational choice when you're talking about the potential for avoiding some part of the debt, which is $30,000 in a lifetime average income advantage of about $1.5 million? Okay, these are really small numbers. You might change the way you behave in any one year to, for example, avoid repayment to keep yourself under the threshold for a while. The chances of you avoiding for more than a year are close to nothing. So then the calculation is going to be the net present value of the advantage of shifting from 1 year. And in a lifetime income context, these are pretty small. Now, I'll make two other points. One, the Australian system is weirdly designed, and people have said to me, how could an economist be involved in such a ridiculous notion that once you earn over $54,000, you have to pay 4% of your total income. So if you calculate that as what we call an effective marginal tax rate, as if you never pay back any of the money, that calculation is 76,000%. This is like the world record effective marginal tax rate. And people are expected to see bunching underneath that, because you can bunch because on the basis of taxable income. So you've got a few deductions. And what we find in the data is, yes, there's bunching. But we also find, when you look longitudinally, that people only do it for 1 year. Should it be fixed? I think so. And ask yourself there's a whole package of questions, and it was really interesting to hear the discussion about loan design in the US context, because of course these things matter. What threshold you want depends on social security obligations, overall levels of graduate incomes and all that. One of the reasons the Australian first threshold is very high, which then required the use of total to get the money back quickly, was to avoid any potential collisions with social security. So once you're under, if you're earning less than $54,000, and particularly if there's no one else in your family working, there'll be social security implications, particularly with the presence of children. All of that's forgotten about if the first threshold is high, but you still get this weird bunching thing. Whether or not you want to live with it, I actually think in Australia you could bring that threshold down a little bit and change the rate from 4 to maybe 2 to avoid the bunching. The other point about...
we got it. If we're going to have more questions.
Well, just a very quick point, and this is about the US choices. You'll get moral hazard or adverse selection or all kinds of weird stuff when you've got a lot of choice. If you said to people, you can have income-based repayment when you've got low income, and you can have non-income-based repayment when you've got really high income, you'll end up with a very bad system.
I think I know a country that has that system.
Yes, I've heard of this. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Marshall Steinbaum. I have a question for Professor Dynarski. The income-based repayment has been presented as, I think, a very effective way to both eliminate delinquency and default, and then potentially, we haven't really talked about this, but also increase completion, which I know is a big issue. And I'm just wondering whether you foresee a possible kind of death spiral in a positive direction, in the sense that, you know, we're basically requiring the people to complete higher education in order to get any kind of decent job at all. And in a world in which, you know, we've eliminated default, everyone's at least paying, but we have no regulations on rising tuition or any reason why tuition wouldn't just go up. There's some evidence that, in fact, you know, tuition is quite responsive to the federal student loan program, and I think the UK evidence is pretty interesting and suggestive that, you know, when you accompany kind of a robust IBR with lax regulations on tuition, you know, essentially you just bid up the cost of college, and in a context in which you sort of have to get this credential to enter the labor market. You know, I'm just sort of envisioning a scenario in which everything that you've said that's good about IBR comes to pass in fact, and yet we end up either with a fiscal crisis or, you know, I mean, even leaving aside the government's finances, just, you know, we're not actually solving the problem of higher education, you know, acting as a barrier to decent outcomes.
So I took Lorraine's point about caps very much to heart, that all of this would have to be combined with, as we have now, caps on borrowing. So we currently have caps on borrowing. An instrument we don't have available to us that the Brits can make use of is caps on tuition. We don't seem to have the political will for that, so given that, we have to have caps on borrowing. I think further and beyond that, we need to have some lower thresholds on quality of institutions. So we have accreditation problems and quality problems in our post-secondary sector. Basically, the easier we make it for people to go to college and pay off their loans, all of which are good things, the easier we make it for scams to occur. So we're going to have to combine a better, and the thing is, so sometimes I feel like it's presented as, well, since we don't feel like fixing the scams, let's just make life hell for borrowers to make sure they don't borrow. And I don't think that's a terrific solution. So, if we're going to have a well-insured system, we need to make sure that the institutions are regulated.
While not denying the thrust of your question, be careful about, the way to interpret the UK thing is not fees were raised to 9,000 and covered by loans, everybody went to 9,000. That was not the UK insanity. The UK insanity was we capped student numbers. There was excess demand, and the 9,000 was a response to excess demand, which is a mistake that you've avoided.
Well, we don't have exactly that structure, but I think the excess demand is definitely present in this country, and that's what I was...
It's on particular institutions, because the quality, just like everywhere, right? On what margin does higher education expand? We don't get more Harvards, we don't get more LSEs. They tend to expand on this so effectively. So we had, there's a hand over here. Is your hand still up? Okay.
Hi, my name is Audrey Peak. I'm with the American Institutes for Research. My question, building on the previous one, was how cost of living is determined in different countries that allow borrowing for cost of living. Just as we don't have tuition caps here, we also don't set cost of living estimates for campuses. We allow them to do it themselves. So I was wondering in other countries how those costs are determined.
Can we ask that from the Swedish context?
Of course, thank you for the question. Cost of living in Sweden, within the Sweden student loan, should cover normal costs. And actually, I was mentioning in my presentation the, coming too close to you, sorry about that. The yearly amount when you can have this loan in every year. So 2/3 is a loan and 1/3 is a grant. So that kind of, the figure, I can get back to you to be more specific.
Does it vary? So does Stockholm have a different
yes, every
living
year,
expense than does Uppsala?
Yeah, that's right.
They do?
Yeah.
Okay. And Lorraine, did you have any insight on?
London, students who go to university in London can get a higher maintenance loan than students who go to university outside London. So it's a London versus the rest.
But it sounds like it's the government setting this as opposed to the institutions.
The government sets it.
So the government is using some sort of formula about what the cost of living is in certain places. We have this lovely system where we let the institutions decide how much it costs to stay in their town. See, they're laughing at us, okay? They're laughing at us, okay? We've got a hand over there.
Hi, Jesse O'Connell, Lumina Foundation. I was hoping you guys could talk a little bit about system scale. I mean, each of your countries, in terms of number of institutions, numbers of students, volume of money, are orders of magnitude smaller than the United States. And given that it's coming up several times today that administration is really what matters with these programs, how feasible is it really to implement some of those policies here?
Doesn't scale up? So, I mean, as a percentage of costs, if you have a larger scale and if there are fixed costs to tax administration, it's not clear to me that they would multiply as the government gets larger. But
I'll just say something. Our rough orders of magnitude are the following. We've got about 600,000 domestic students in a population of 22 million. About 40% of our young people aged 18 to 20 enrol in college or university, which is similar to yours. So while the numbers are much smaller in proportionate terms, they're not so different. Economies of scale, I don't really understand, because the marginal cost of collecting on top of an existing collection arrangement is not going to have economies of scale. You've already got them. They're already there. So if you multiplied our number of people by 10 enrolled, I think you'd have the same marginal cost, which is 2 to 3%.
And I think if the United States was 10 Australias, no problem. It's not the scale of the thing, it's the sheer diversity, which in the US system is so much greater than, as I understand, well, the UK and as I understand it, Australia. And there is an issue, and Sue's already alluded to some of the issues, a cap on student loans, quality assurance, those issues. I don't think it's a scale issue, it's how you design one national loan system to accommodate a very diverse system, and my guess is there isn't a single simple answer. It would be an evolutionary process, but based around income-based repayments collected on a current basis.
This, I think, would be a terrific place to highlight something that I don't know if was clear when you were listening to the presentations. When people are talking about their student finance programs, this is typically what they're talking about in Sweden and England and Australia. They're talking about university. Yeah. Higher education means BA. It means going for a BA. So they're talking about the funding of their BA institutions. They typically have a separate funding structure for technical education. So it's called further education and some general education. For us, it's community colleges. Right, AA institutions, and they are quite different. They're attached to different labor markets. They have different structures, and it may well be that we would need to have a structure for people seeking BAs and a separate funding structure with a different set of tax rates for people who are seeking shorter term education levels. Anybody else want to? Okay.
This is a perfect segue to my question. My name is Taylor White. I work here in Washington at the Australian Embassy for the Australian Department of Education and Training.
A plant.
Well, I'm going to ask my question very carefully, lest I drag up all sorts of current events. But I should say I'm the reverse. I'm an American working for the Australians here in the U.S., so we were all scrambled between the three of us. But my question has to do with these different systems. So obviously, in the Australian context right now, it's a hot topic that the inclusion of the vet sector in the HEC scheme has put a lot of tension on the system. And so without...
Can you say what the vet...
The vet sector, I'm sorry, that's the sort of vocational education sector, so the equivalent, the TAFEs, the equivalent of community colleges and for-profit training institutions. And so I noted in the presentations that these, again, were about higher education insofar as they are defined as universities only. I was wondering if Sweden and the UK and Germany might talk a little bit about how the funding systems for their vocational sectors differ and what sort of calculations are made based on the demographics, the type of occupations you anticipate people entering, et cetera, and what sort of design differences you've made to account for those differences in the student population and institutional populations.
Okay. Who wants to start? Nick? No, Lorraine?
No, Nick.
Or just let's pass the ball back and forth. Okay.
I'll do.
Okay. Bruce.
The vocational education and training system in Australia is, in the private sector, is about as close as you get to for-profits arrangements in the US, if I understand them properly. And we had a bit of a disaster, it is accurate to say, over the last 2 years, where the income contingent loan, which was only designed basically for universities but including graduate schools, went into that sector with very poor regulatory cover. And a lot of providers who had not established reputations, who were not clearly of high quality, had the access to this extraordinarily powerful, generous instrument called an income contingent loan without too many quality controls or regulatory arrangements, and it lost a lot of money. And it's extremely important to understand the potency of this instrument. It's basically a gift to the institutions, and you really have to watch very carefully how it's used, particularly in the profit-making sector.
Nick?
Just following on from Bruce's point, I could set up the Nick Barr rip-off School of Economics, charge a high fee, students come, if they don't earn very much, they don't repay, they know it. If they don't earn very much, the taxpayer coughs up, not me. So there are horrible adverse incentives, which is why quality assurance is absolutely essential. In the UK, the loan system I've described is only for BA, etc. We treat our vocational education very badly. I don't understand the details, but I gather it's complex and a mess. My own view is the income contingent mechanism is crying out to be extended to plumbers, hairdressers, sort of a whole range of things. The parameters might well be different. A few years ago with a colleague, I did a simulation of the repayment performance of loans in the vocational sector, and somewhat to our surprise, the repayment performance was better because the loans are smaller and of a shorter duration. So the answer is we don't in the UK, but we should.
Well, Sweden is that, if I understand your question correctly, we don't have any tuition fees, so there's a long tradition with that. And the state actually funds the universities, almost every university in Sweden. So there are very few private universities.
If somebody is doing sort of technical education
Yeah.
as opposed to an academic degree,
Yeah.
is that done through universities or a
that's right.
separate structure?
No,
So it is in Sweden, it's all in one thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the UK, maintenance for those doing vocational
Say what
education.
what's maintenance?
So student grants for those doing vocational education and loans is terrible. So they do not have access to nearly as much generous support for their
But
living
you're
costs.
talking about sub-degree tertiary rather than plumbing or things like that? Or
Both.
Both,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything below
Okay.
university degree.
Okay. Number 3. In Germany, we have a very complex system on vocational training, and in the how to describe it's you can realize professional degrees in professional schools. For example, they are. If I compare it to the level of the community colleges in the United States, they are on a higher level, and they are leading to technical degrees, but to economic degrees as well, and in the social sector. Then you have a system, and there are about 1.8 million participants actually in a dual system. That means that those which are involved in this training programs, they are learning for 3 or 4 years. They are learning in enterprises. On the other hand, they are learning in professional schools as well. And if they are reaching or achieving their degree, they are partly, or some of them are able as well to enter universities or universities for applied sciences, because there is some kind of transition. But during this time, when they are learning in this dual system, they are earning some money, some salary, of course, and they are free of tuitions as well in this system.
So borrowing was quite low. It was 18% for people going to university. What's borrowing for people who are doing this other technical training?
Oh, it's actually they are going more to university than in our vocational training program. Yes, and this
Are the people in the vocational training programs borrowing? Do they borrow
No,
loans?
they don't.
They don't
They
borrow
don't
loans.
borrow
So this
because
is,
they are-
it's being
because-
paid.
Yes,
Okay.
And
So,
on the other hand, if, for example, if they are visiting professional schools, full-time professional schools, they are able to realize financial support by the government as well. So this is a difference. Yeah.
So, I mean, what I would, so the bad players in the for-profit world have figured out how to play our current system. And what you described of, bad incentives and people going and borrowing a lot and they're not repaying it and the government's picking up the tab is happening right now, to great cost to the affected students, because they go into default and their credit records are affected. And an income contingent loan, and so an income contingent loan system would shift the cost would still be paid by the government, but it wouldn't hurt the students. Now, the ideal world, we would fix and regulate the for-profit sector. But if we're not going to do that, do the risks and the cost of all that and the pain of it fall on the students or on the taxpayer? My thinking, you can guess, is that if we're going to be so lazy and cowardly as to not regulate higher education and accredit it properly, then the risk should not fall on the students. The cost of that needs to fall on the polity, which is unwilling to do this regulation. There's a hand, there's two, and Art's had his hand up for a while as well.
So I feel badly because Art has had his hand up for a while. But Zakiya Smith, Lumina Foundation, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the cultural context of each of your countries that maybe has made some aspect of reform difficult. So when I think about the United States, we are now having what I would call a backlash against student loans. When I talk to my grandmother, college in an era where there were no student loans, she thought the idea that someone would loan you money to go to college was revolutionary and it'd be fantastic. The students who are going to college today have no memory of that time when you didn't have the access, and now we have a different cultural kind of context of student loans, which is what it is, and leads to kind of different just challenges in how we think about what might be possible because of what that means in terms of the political realities of what people are asking for. So in each of your countries, what are some of the things that maybe have been difficult that people have tried to do, but because of the cultural context there's been pushback?
Christina, you want to start?
Thank you. I would say that due to surveys we have done in Sweden, we have learned that quite many people wouldn't have gone on to higher education if there wasn't a possibility to borrow these student loans. So, and that is a figure quite high, I would say 40 to 50% or something. So that is the cultural tradition in Sweden. So quite many people go on, as I mentioned in my presentation, to higher education thanks to this system.
I think I've always been fascinated. So the contract, you're right next to each other. So Sweden, it's very firm that if you are 18 plus, you're an adult separate from your parents, right? And that is how the funding framework and the way we're thinking about it goes. Therefore, there's no subsidies based on your family's income, for example, or no expectation of your parents contributing. A very different, and also that you don't live at home while you go to school. People don't live at home while they go to school. A different set of cultural assumptions is in Germany.
Okay, we have no culture of borrowing money for investing in education. And that explains, for example, when we introduced tuition fees, some of those which could have studied, they didn't enter to study, they went into our vocational training programs. And on the other hand, those which studied, they increased their employment, their own employment, to earn more money for financing their studies. And maybe there are more opportunities for jobs that they can finance their studies, but the offered loan systems, they weren't taken, and as you have seen, there are only 6% which are borrowing money for financing their study.
But there's an expectation, an explicit expectation of 735 euros for each student of support from their parents as long as their income is above, was it 45,000 euros? What was the?
It's 45,000 euros. These are the study costs.
Yeah.
No, the income of 38,000. From 38,000 euro, parents have to pay fully.
Okay, so with parents with income of 50,000 and above, the expectation is that they're coughing up $12,000 a year for their kids' living expenses. So yes, the tuition is free, but their parents are supposed to be coughing up $1,000. So that's sort of it's very different from the Swedish example.
But on the other hand, if you're paying for parents, you will get reduces from paying taxes on the other hand as well. Mm-hmm. So this is a big advantage as well.
I know Nick wanted to. Do you want to?
Oh well, given he's British and I'm not.
You're just kind of a mutt. Is that okay?
But,
all right, here we go.
Well, I will act as the warm-up act for Bruce, who will tell you the stories of Australia, where he was chased by 10,000 students down the streets of Canberra. When we introduced loans in the UK for the first time in 1989, there was the biggest there was the biggest demonstration ever outside Parliament. I was going around doing student debates saying, loans are the right idea, but they're the wrong sort of loans. They shouldn't be mortgage loans. They should be income contingent loans. And I was regarded as a fascist hyena. Within 5 years, the students at my public economics lectures were busily taking down market failures, mortgage loans, inefficient, etc., etc. Cultural views can change. That's point one. Point two, you've got to be very careful to distinguish between what people say and what people do. If I asked you, how do you feel about a higher price for wine, you're going to give me a grumpy answer. Does that mean you're not going to drink wine at a higher price? Different question, different answer. And the final point, it's not just a cultural difference from your grandmother's era. When I was a student, 5% of Brits went to university. Today, it's 50%. One of the drivers for bringing in loans is that's what's necessary to open up the system to give chances who, when I was an undergraduate, to people who wouldn't have got anywhere near university and should have done and didn't then, and it was an outrage, and they can today.
The hardest thing in countries like England, New Zealand and Australia is that they came from zero tuition to the introduction of tuition. And that was the big fight. I don't know if I call it cultural, but it was certainly political, and it was certainly about where you start from is absolutely critical to understanding what will cause angst and anxiety and frustration and hatred even. And that was the point. Universities should be free, that was the mantra. And what mattered in Australia was, and probably England, and maybe through Nick, was the demonstration that this is actually regressive, because the people who are paying, when free means paid for by all taxpayers. So who's paying for the Australian system? Well, 70% of people who don't know where a university is. Is this a reasonable thing when the private benefits are very high? It's not a reasonable thing, particularly with an income contingent solution to that. But Nick's kind of got this right, and as well as for Australia. It didn't take long before that was considered to be okay, and partly the politicians were astute. And setting that first income threshold of repayment at average income was a really profound political move, because the argument was, how could you fight against something which is going to charge you $10 a week, which will deliver you $1 million over your lifetime, and you only have to pay it when you're earning more than the average taxpayer? That's pretty hard rhetorically to fight. And now it's not at all controversial. We didn't have any other loan system to compare it with. So if we had a Stafford loan system, the debate would have been Stafford versus income contingent, not free versus income contingent. The value of income contingency wasn't really pointed out or understood, including by me, in my view, but it became apparent later. And now I think it's accurate to say that this system is very well regarded by the users.
As having a stake in both the UK and Australian system, I think that, you know, one of the key differences between the two systems is in the UK you get a loan for support, maintenance and fees, whereas in Australia it's just fees, and that reflects cultural differences. A lot of Australian students study in the city where they live. You know, it's basically a 6-city country, and so you know.
How many does England have?
Yeah, you know, I went to ANU. I lived in Canberra. I went to ANU, and that. Whereas in UK, the expectation is that you move when you go to university, and so cultural things I think have got a lot to do between the differences between the two systems.
Art Alton. So I had one quick historical comment and then 3 quick questions. On the it'll be quick.
This is why I waited on you,
Thank
Art.
you.
This is
On the historical, just to let people know, in 1987-88, Bob Reischauer wrote a paper on using Social Security for the student loan program, and Michael Dukakis, at the urging of Gene Sperling, put it into his program, and it was changed from what Bob had said. So had we done it at that time, instead we went to an income tax-based system rather than a payroll-based system, and I think probably to our detriment. Quick questions. One was on Sweden, a little bit more elaboration on why you went back to a mortgage-style repayment. On Australia, the vocational program, my understanding is also that Australia is now lending on living expenses to some extent, and at least that's what I was told. And I was wondering whether Bruce wants to comment on whether or not that's detracted from the reputation and efficacy of HECS, both those things. And the third one is for everybody. Basically, if you go around the countries that are represented here and other countries like New Zealand, the loans have helped to raise the participation rates, no question, as Nick said, but we all have equity gaps still. We all have big differences between low income and high income. And the loans don't seem to have solved that. And so I'm curious what you think from your experience why that is.
okay.
Yes, please. I think that the reason we left the income contingent loan was the system led to quite high borrowing, speaking of Swedish matters and figures, because there were no really incentive for the borrower, for the student to finish their studies in time. And at the same time, we had this economic recession with greater or higher interest. So I think it was that kind of combination that actually led to this modified mortgage loan.
But a response could have been to set caps on borrowing
Yeah.
and subsidize the interest rate.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there could have been a way to modify
Yeah.
the income contingent program to
Yeah.
address.
Yeah, that's right. Could have been like that. Yeah.
Australian issue.
You can talk about Australia, yeah.
Yep. Income support could be used in theory and in concept very easily as an extension to our system, and it happens in the UK, it happens in New Zealand. I'd probably be tempted to have it as an add-on, for example, to cover textbook costs or moving costs when people are first students, or computing costs when they're first students. Not to make it complicated, maybe an extra $1,000 per year, but not to undermine the grant system. As far as vocational education and training is concerned, there is no reason at all why you shouldn't have an income contingent system all through post-compulsory schooling, in my view, so long as you've got the accreditation issues there writ large, as Nick suggested. You probably need a lower threshold in Australia because the incomes are a bit lower, but I think it's all completely manageable, and there have been people about my size, although getting shorter, who've been saying this for 26 years.
There are many causes of inequality. If we understood them better, we could solve them. We should solve them. Increasing participation has a net effect of leading to inequality being less than it otherwise would. If we'd kept participation at 5% and simply changed the makeup of people going to university, I'm not sure I would believe that. But expanding to 50% and having a lot more people from poorer backgrounds going to university, the net effect is to reduce inequality. Is it enough? Hell no. A lot more to go. But you can't, higher education in general, can't solve all the causes of inequality, particularly today.
One extraordinary fact of the English and UK system is that ethnic minorities do much better by the end of school and are significantly more likely to participate in higher education than any the white British are the least likely to. So we do have socioeconomic inequality based on income, but we do not. Ethnic inequality is completely different.
Are we going to get questions from Twitter at some point that we need to pay attention to? Who is gathering those? No? Geez, Twitter people. Oh, Andrew has a question.
Andrew Kelly from Jason's future employer, American Enterprise Institute. We're taking him in because he needs a job. Just kidding. Professor Dearden, in your remarks, you referenced when you were talking about the risk, how the risk falls entirely on the taxpayers or the polity, as Sue said. And you mentioned very briefly in passing that Professor Barr was working on some ideas around risk retention on the part of institutions. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. That's a debate we're having here as well. And so if either of you could weigh in on how such a system might work.
So part of the problem, the big problem when we went from 3,000 fees to 9,000 fees, there was no incentives for universities to do anything other than charge because they bore none of the costs. And there was a number of ways they could have fixed that by, for every £1,000, they would only, they could have come, and initially when
So continue, for every £1,000?
So if a university charged an extra £1,000, the government would give it 70, it would tax at 70%, and between 7.5 and 9, it would tax at 50%. The problem was that elite universities like Oxford and Cambridge said, that's just way too high, we're going to go private, because our students, and so they dropped it. I don't believe they would have. Because
they would have opted out of the system.
Opted out of the system, because the government's cost of borrowing is way lower than what they are. But they threatened that and they pulled out. But Nick's doing some work on how you might do it.
We had a review in 2010 that, as Lorraine said, proposed that as fees went up about a certain level, the government would take an increasing slice. But what you need to do is not target on the fee level, but on the university's risk. In other words, if it charges high fees, but its borrowers all go on to have high earnings and repay their loans, they're low risk. If they charge high fees and low earnings. So this is a paper that I wrote with Neil Shepard of Harvard, and it was merely an in principles paper, which said that income contingent loans are designed to make a loss on people with low lifetime earnings. The question is where that loss should fall. And in the UK and Australia, it falls on the taxpayer. It could be shared between the taxpayer and or the cohort of student borrowers by charging a cohort risk premium and or a university-specific insurance premium, whereby if the loans that Oxford University makes on its fees above some level makes a loss of X%, then if Oxford charges a fee of £15,000, the Student Loans Administration that currently pays the fee money on behalf of the student would hand over not 15,000 but 14,200. And the principles are very clear. The difficulty is how you actually quantify, and there some work is being done, but it's a question of getting hold of the data. I mean, Lorraine's been very much involved in that, and I hope will tell us some more about it. But it raises a general issue for the UK and the US. Lots of data are being gathered at taxpayer expense. Education, health, transport, you name it, that are not being made available to researchers. And this to me is absolutely nuts. So there is a huge data access for bona fide researchers agenda for both our countries that's much wider than higher education finance. And Lorraine knows much more about the quantification than I do.
I'm not allowed to say anything.
Oh, but some of it's been published.
Some of it's been published, yeah. Well, some universities have given us permission, so doing economics at LSE is very, very good.
But there is a paper that's in the public domain.
No, yes. We've got a published paper. It's on the Institute for Fiscal Studies workshop where we look by subject and institution. It's based on students who took out loans at the very beginning, so in 1998. And we've got 12 years of earnings of these students, and we can see what the returns are by institution and subject, gender, high income versus the rest.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Okay, sure. We've got 15 minutes.
This question of risk, the risk for the institutions, is a much bigger question in a world of price discretion. When you've got price caps, it almost doesn't matter so much if you've designed the system properly. When you don't have price caps, you've got to put attention into this because it's a great monopoly instrument that the institutions can abuse by charging very large sums and not actually having any so-called skin in the game about the returns. How you measure these things is really hard, but that's if you wanted to go to a universal contingent loan and have full price discretion, a lot of attention has to go to that question.
Jason, did you want to contribute to this, or is it a separate question?
I did.
Okay.
A quick question, which is, so on the. I'm sorry, I've forgotten my question now.
If it was was it about risk sharing?
Yeah,
or
I
no?
mean, yeah, it's about.
You'll find a different
we'll come
question.
back to it. Yes.
Okay. All right. All right.
I thought you waved me off, so it's
My name is Colleen Campbell. I'm from the Association of Community College Trustees. So
and a UM grad.
Sorry?
University of Michigan grad.
And I'm a University of Michigan graduate. And thinking about career and technical education, bringing together this point about risk sharing and having institutions have some skin in the game, but then also thinking about the incredible diversity of our system and the open access nature of community colleges in particular, and the fact that the students that attend community colleges have a different kind of risk profile for not repaying their loans than students that might enroll at, say, a selective four-year institution. How would you model a risk-sharing system kind of based on the system that we have now and not on one where you have pretty solid control over the quality of your institutions and you're holding your students to a certain bar across the board?
So one thing to remember as you're thinking about this is that we have the Pell Grant system, right? So while in England, for example, at this point there are no grants that you can use as a tool in this world, we can, and our community colleges tend to charge tuitions about half those of the universities. So,
I think that, I mean, it's not a one-size-fits-all prescription. Some universities, you know, Harvard, Yale, Chicago, LSE, University College London, compete internationally. It's a competitive environment, and the safeguards we've been talking about on quality assurance matter. There are other institutions, community colleges or access universities in the UK, that cater to a local population. They are doing a different and fundamentally important task. It's not clear that the loan model, let alone the competitive price model, is the right model for them. As Sue said, Pell Grants, grants in general, might well be a more appropriate instrument, at least at that stage. And if students then progress from community colleges to four-year degree colleges, then the loan system comes into play. Now, I'm not saying I'm sure that's the right answer, but at least I'd want detailed reflection around that approach.
Well, I mean, there are bound to be huge complexities. I mean, it's very hard for outsiders to understand the institutions. And it'd be kind of arrogant to say too much about it, but I would say this, that you have to put the attention, I think, into some kind of cap arrangement. It's price caps in our countries. It's probably loan caps in this country. And then the caps would have to be determined by the institutional complexities and targeted in ways that accommodate some price discretion. But the critical thing is, I mean, you kind of need caps of various kinds anyway, no matter what loan system you've got, because in the end, the government's picking up the tab for the unpaid debt. So it's not that far away from that. But the institutional design issues, which were covered really nicely, I thought, in the penultimate session here, they're fundamental, and I don't think we can say much about them.
Hi, Ben Miller from the Center for American Progress. I was wondering if you could talk about, for the places that have the income contingent loans where the employers are doing the withholding, can you talk a little bit more about the system from the employer perspective in sort of three key ways? You know, first I'm sort of wondering, how did employers react to when you created these things and had them suddenly start doing the withholding? Like, did they object? Did they go along with it? Two, what happens if an employer makes a mistake in the calculation and sort of either withholds too much or too little? And then three, how do you handle the multiple jobs problem that we heard talked about on the prior panel, where people might have income coming from multiple sources and doing the calculation there?
In the Australian context, the last two issues are all done by reconciliation through the tax system at the end of the financial year. So that's kind of straightforward. If an employer makes a mistake, it all gets sorted out with the annual income tax arrangement. That doesn't have to go through the tax system, just happens to be efficient in the Australian context. It could be done through another office. So the extra job stuff, if you haven't paid contingent loan on that income there, it all gets fixed up, as I understand it, after the end of the year. But you're not talking about big sums of money. I don't know if employers objected, and the fact that I don't know kind of implies that I either didn't notice or they didn't. And I kind of would have noticed. I certainly noticed the 10,000 students burning effigies of me and hanging little statues and stuff. So I would have focused on the employers. The employers were, as far as I could see, kind of benign and didn't really notice it.
How do they know to withhold?
Well, they're instructed. I mean, it's a law.
Who instructs them, though? Because not all employees have loans.
Now, the loans are provided by the government.
So the
student has...
This is a very down and dirty question. Like, somebody gets hired, how does the employer know that that person needs to have loan payments withheld from their check?
Because everyone has...
So in the UK, we get a tax code, so you know how much the tax-free threshold is. You get national insurance where you pay Social Security, it's a fixed threshold, and you get a notice, you get a tax notice saying this person has a student loan, you should start deducting 9% above 21,000 from this date, and they tell you when. If you have multiple jobs in the UK, I don't know that this is a well-known feature, it is you just look at the salary in each job, and it's only if the salary in the job so they're treated like separate jobs. So if you've got two
This is
jobs,
how taxes work in the US
I mean,
too.
and it's the same with national insurance. If you've got two jobs where you earn £20,000 a year, you pay nothing on your student loan because you're below the 21,000 threshold in job 1 and job 2. You pay nothing. So you know,
And it doesn't get reconciled.
It
at the
doesn't
end
get
of the year?
no. National insurance exactly the same. National insurance threshold is £110 a week. If you've got two jobs below 110, you pay no national insurance. So it's just
Jason's economic model is that everyone should move to the UK and get two jobs.
But the tax,
that's the prediction.
But the tax system, it's all added together and reconciled at the end of the year and completely different. It also means that we have statutory maternity pay. If you have two jobs above the national insurance limit, you get double. It's the statutory maternity pay.
That's because the insanity of the British system is income tax is annual, social security is weekly or monthly, ditto student loans. So if you've got two employers, for income tax, one employer gets your tax code saying, here's your tax-free allowance, and you pay tax only above it. The other one gets a code that says, tax him on the lot. But that's only for income tax.
And so I just point out, we have no similar system in this country where the government sends information to employers to tell them how much to withhold and when right now. We have nothing like that.
But it could be the Student Loans Administration that has the power to inform employers. Just coming back to the point about employers in Britain in 1989 made somewhat grumpy noises. But remember, all the historical cases we're talking about occurred before computerization was as totally universal as it is now. And now sort of the software packages just deal with it.
In the Australian case, there's no need for the government to do anything because the student has a unique identifier, a unique social security number or tax file number. To get the debt, they have to produce that. And then at their job, they have to produce that. So everybody knows we're also breaking the law, and it's kind of hard to get out of that.
The UK system's unique in that most taxpayers don't do a tax return, right? So the tax code that the employers get take into account what they paid for charity and so most lower rate taxpayers do not do a tax return. So it's an automated system and the employers adjust. So that's why it's very different from Australia where everybody does a tax return and it's an annual reconciliation in the US.
Which is suited by earlier one, it's a huge point in comparing doing loans through tax code in the US and the UK.
Well, but
the most important difference.
No. But the national insurance system is completely different. It's just so that the national insurance and student loan is completely different from the tax code. So it's now if you've got two jobs, they're two jobs, and just it's very simple.
So Kevin had a question.
No, I just said for what it's worth, I think in New Zealand.
You'll have to yell since you don't have your.
For what it's worth, I think in New Zealand they just check a box when they get a job to say that they have a loan.
He said that in New Zealand, when they get a job, they check a box that they have a loan on the. So when we get a new job, we give to our employers a form we filled out that our W-4, which has our tax number and all this other information, and on that could be a box which is. I have a student loan. Now, there could be some reconciliation at the end of the year where you think, Jason, you did not say you had a student loan. We are going to now withhold something from your annual tax return or increase your payments or something to fix that.
I think the UK has both. When you start a new job, you tip. But they catch up with you.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to let these guys know if you have something that you want to say that hasn't been covered by questions. I think we got enough time that you could each have like a minute to say that. So I'll take one more question and then we will do that. Yep. Any more questions? Okay. So who is Bruce? Now we got 3 minutes left.
I want to reinforce something that Nick said in his talk. Contingent loans are really different. And if you think about contingent loans like normal loans, you'll get the story quite wrong. And it came out in the last discussion before this one. The idea that in a focus group people said, oh my God, you've got a contingent loan that's going to take me 30 years to pay off. Why would I ever want that? That's because they're holding constant the amount of payment per period, and of course it's worse off. But for loans in our countries, Australia and England, that go on for 30 years, there might be 15 years of no repayment at all. Why is that? Because the incomes are low. So if you frame the question in not how long it takes, but how much you pay and how many years you don't pay because your income is below the threshold, you get such a different perspective on the value of it.
Point of detail and then a broader point. Point of detail, income contingency protects people with low earnings. There are people who want to get rid of their debt fast. Any well-designed loan system should allow people at any time to send a cheque to the Student Loans Administration paying off their student loan wholly or in part. In the UK, the only restriction is if you send a cheque, it's got to be for at least £500 just to keep administration down. My bigger point...
20% paid off early. I've seen the data.
My bigger point is when the Beatles were in their prime, at a press conference, a journal said to Ringo, "What do you call that haircut?" And Ringo's answer was Arthur. And that makes the point, you can call anything you like, and the words you use should be the words that create the greatest happiness. So people worry about debt, and they worry about the stock of debt. If you focus them on the flow of repayments, the payroll deduction, it changes things. I say to parents, do you lie awake worrying about your child's future tax bill? And they goggle at me as though I was slightly batty. The flow we're all relaxed about. So focus on the flow. Tell students, in the annual statement, say, if you continue paying at your present rate, we think you will have finished paying in between 8 and 9 years, rather than saying, you owe us $24,820. So you can call it a loan, or you can call it a tax. Or, economics teacher of mine many years ago said, why do we call it the national debt? Why don't we call it the national credit? Call it student credits rather than student debts. So all I'm saying is think for whatever design parameters you choose, the nerdy technical stuff, think very hard about the words you use. And a higher education contribution scheme in Australia was much better than the UK, where the word debt was allowed to escape and run around like a rabid ferret.
Okay. Lorraine, do you have any?
No.
No? Okay. Malcolm?
Okay. I wanted to answer at least to the question of this colleague concerning inequity. I would say in reality, we didn't reduce inequity totally. We didn't. But we enabled participation for those with our system. And if you are asking me for some recommendations, I know that it would be non-real to transit our system to the United States. But perhaps you could make the community colleges free of tuition fees to widen access. And on the other hand, for the loan system, it would perhaps helpful to reduce the sum of loans, like we do it, and for example, and on the other hand, whether the national government is paying the interest, which we are doing as well. So this could be, for example, transparent for those which are forced to take loans on one hand, and on the other hand, they know what they have to pay back and in which period. And otherwise, and this is I think it's a political discussion, we say why we are against tuition fees and system of loans in Germany. We see it as an additional tax, income tax, for those which have studied, which have realized. And we know that when they have finished their studies, not all of them are realizing high salaries. That's a problem. So our system depends on the economic capacity. Who is able to pay high taxes, he pays. And these are not only academics. These are always people which have learned in a handicraft, which founded an enterprise, and so on.
Christina?
Yes, please, thank you. The system in Sweden has actually been working. I've been telling you about that in my presentation for the last 15 years. And as I was mentioning, the write-offs went down from 20% to 8%. the borrowers we have in Sweden, quite many of them, of course, live in Sweden. Only 4% reside abroad, but they have a higher debt to pay back. Quite many of these borrowers residing abroad live here in the US, and quite many live in the UK. Today we have an agreement with the UK and the Netherlands to change addresses. But what I would really like to have, before I go back to Sweden, is some kind of, not an agreement of course, but some information from you guys. Who could I address here in the US to just start the discussion? Could we have some kind of a cooperation in exchanging addresses? We have taken legal action in California, state of California, as you probably know, and we have been successful. But that costs a lot of money, so it could be more handy to start with the address exchange.
So everyone within the sound of my voice, look for the scofflaw Swedes and send their addresses, please, to Christina. Okay. All right. I really appreciate all the wonderful questions. This has been a terrific discussion. As I said, we are going to be moving on to some socializing, and you can ask further questions. I hope you treat all these folks here as a resource in your own work. The resources that I mentioned at our website, at the Education Policy Initiative, are there, including their contact information. Let's go fix everything. Thank you.